Imani kept her eyes lowered as she moved toward the sideboard, her movements a practiced dance of invisibility. To the men at the table, she was just a uniform, a vessel for their expensive wine. But beneath the starched white shirt beat the heart of a woman who once deconstructed $50 million mergers before breakfast. 3 years ago, Imani Brooks hadn't been a waitress. She had been a senior corporate auditor, a polyglot of profit and loss statements who could find a missing decimal point in a 1,000-page ledger as easily as a heartbeat. She had a reputation, a high-rise office, and a future that felt as solid as the gold leaf on the ceiling. Then came the embezzlement, a sophisticated, brutal scheme orchestrated by a powerful executive she had trusted completely. He hadn't just stolen the money, he had stolen her name, meticulously falsifying records to ensure that when the house of cards collapsed, she was the one caught under the debris. She had sat in rooms full of lawyers, understanding with agonizing clarity every word being used to dismantle her life, yet unable to stop any of it. She lost her license, her savings, and her dignity in a single fraudulent stroke. But the true weight didn't come from the loss of her office. It came from the mounting debts her father had accrued while trying to save a family business that was already drowning. Every week, a new bill arrived, a cold, numerical reminder that her father was fighting a battle his bank account could no longer win. When the world took her career, it took her right to be sad, too. She had lost the luxury of grief. There was no time to mourn the woman she used to be, when the woman she was now had to stand for 12 hours a day just to keep the lights on. So she learned to be a ghost. She learned to smile at men who never looked her in the eye, and to stay silent while they discussed things they assumed she was too uneducated to understand. She had spent months burying the expert who understood the language of power, trying to forget that she could hear the truth hiding inside what wasn't being said. But as she glanced at the contract sitting between Ryu Takahashi and James Reber, the auditor inside her, the one she thought she had killed, started screaming. The numbers on that table weren't just a deal, they were a death sentence. James N. Reiber leaned forward, the navy fabric of his suit straining slightly as he projected an aura of absolute transparency. He spoke of synergy and mutual growth, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone that filled the private dining room like heavy smoke. Across from him, Ryu Takahashi sat in a terrifyingly composed silence, his inked fingers resting on the edge of the table, as if weighing the soul of the man speaking. To anyone else, it looked like a standard negotiation between titans, but Imani saw the tremor of a predator's pulse in Reiber's neck, the telltale sign of a man who was lying for sport. The dealer pushed a thick stack of paperwork across the polished mahogany, specifically Clause 7, the asset reversion provision. Reiber's legal advisor, a man with a sharp, clinical German accent, tapped a specific line and spoke with a sudden, urgent precision. The lawyer's words in German were clear and professional. The clause created unacceptable legal exposure, a loophole that would allow a third party to seize the primary investor's assets upon a technical default. It was a red flag large enough to stop a heart, a warning that the entire structure of the deal was compromised. But James Reiber didn't translate the fear. He didn't mention the loophole or the legal exposure. Instead, he smiled at Ryu and spoke with the ease of a man who believed the person across from him didn't speak the language of the fine print. "My counsel is just remarking on the timeline, Ryu," Reiber lied, his tone dismissive and light. "He's impressed by the efficiency of the structure. He believes we're ready to finalize the 50-50 split we discussed." Imani stood at the sideboard, her hand tightening around a clean cloth. Her mind, the auditor's mind that had been trained to spot the rot in the foundation of billion-dollar corporations, cataloged the crime in real time. She knew the contract on that table didn't say 50-50. Buried in subsection language that assumed Ryu wouldn't care to verify, the split had been quietly shifted to 60-40 in Ryber's favor. It was the same sharp smile that had destroyed her own life 3 years ago, the smile of a man who had already decided someone else would take the fall. The room was silent, save for the muffled clinking of silverware from the main floor. But for Imani, the air felt electric with the static of a looming disaster. She watched the dealers steering Ryu toward the signature line, knowing that once the ink dried, the trap would spring shut. The invisible woman was the only person in the room who could hear the scream behind the silence. Imani stood at the sideboard, her fingers tracing the hem of a linen napkin as she watched the predator close the trap. She thought about her family, the crushing weight of the debts that had turned their lives into a daily exercise in survival, and the smile her father wore to hide his exhaustion. She thought about the powerful executive who had once sat across a mahogany table just like this one, watching her take the fall for a crime he had engineered with a sharp smile and a practiced lie. She had been the one shouting into a silence that nobody chose to hear, raising professional concerns in a language that was being translated into a death sentence. She felt something ignite in her chest, a stubborn, inconvenient heat she hadn't felt in 3 years. She recognized this room. She had lived this betrayal from the other side, and the cost of staying silent was a price she was no longer willing to pay. She was done being invisible by necessity, done being a ghost in a room full of men who traded in the lives of others. She straightened her uniform and adjusted the wine hitcher, her movements unhurried and purposeful. She didn't go to James Ryber, the man with the expensive suit and the hidden agenda. She walked directly toward Ryu Takahashi, moving into the circle of light cast by the crystal chandeliers with the particular calm of a woman who had already counted the cost and decided to pay it. As she approached his side of the table, the air in the private room seemed to thicken, the silence carrying a weight that only she seemed to feel. Ryu didn't look up immediately, but she felt his stillness shift, the patient, unreadable focus of a man who knew the most interesting things in any room usually came from the direction nobody was watching. Imani leaned forward slightly, respectful but composed, her voice pitched low enough that it didn't carry beyond the four of them. The world outside the frosted glass panels ceased to exist. There was only the contract, the lie, and the truth she was about to release.
Mr. Takahashi, I apologize for the interruption, but your interests are being compromised, Imani whispered, her voice a low anchor in the rising storm of the room. Every eye at the table turned to her, James N. Ryber's expression shifting from arrogant ease to a panicked calculation in half a second. She didn't blink as she told Ryu about the recording device hidden beneath the mahogany and the 60-40 split buried in the fine print that his dealer had conveniently ignored. The silence that followed had the physical weight of an impending landslide. Ryu didn't move. His unreadable eyes remained fixed on Ryber, who had gone completely still. The dealer opened his mouth to lie one last time, saw the absolute, terrifying stillness in Ryu's face, and closed it. With a subtle nod from Ryu, the broad-shouldered man at the door opened the exit. Ryber picked up his jacket and left without another word, the door closing with a soft, final click that sounded louder than a slam in the quiet room. Imani took a step back, the adrenaline beginning to cool into a sharp, familiar dread. She knew the cost of this truth. Gerald Pittman, the restaurant manager, who prided himself on a composure that was usually his only armor, was already waiting behind the frosted glass. He was sweating, a sight Imani had never seen in 6 months. "My office," he breathed, his voice trembling with a panic that reached his very marrow. Inside the small, cramped room, Gerald didn't even look at her. Do you have any idea who you just spoke to? Do you understand what that name means in this city? He straightened his jacket, his hands shaking as he delivered the sentence they both knew was coming. I have no choice. I know, Imani said, her voice steady even as her heart hammered against her ribs. She collected her things from the staff locker, a single bag holding the remnants of her invisible life. She walked out into the Atlanta night, warm, loud, and utterly indifferent to the fact that she had just lost the only job keeping her family from the brink. She stood on the sidewalk with $7 in her checking account and a mountain of debt waiting for her at home like a bad roommate. She was jobless, exposed, and for the first time in years, she was no longer a ghost.
The Atlanta night received Imani with its usual indifference, the air warm and thick with the hum of Friday night energy. She walked down Peachtree Road, a woman with $7 in her checking account and no future, wandering through a skyline that glittered with a wealth she no longer possessed. She did something she hadn't allowed herself to do in years. She felt the fear, the exhaustion, and the grief she had been suppressing behind a waitress's smile. She didn't notice the man following her until she caught his reflection in a darkened shop window. He was a tall figure, keeping pace about 20 feet behind her, his movements unhurried but relentless. Imani quickened her stride, turning onto a side street to lose him, but when a second figure stepped out of a building entrance ahead of her, her stomach dropped completely. She stopped walking, boxed in by the heavy-jawed men sent to ensure the waitress who knew too much would be discouraged from ever speaking again. The man in front reached into his jacket, his face set in the mechanical expression of someone performing a routine task. But before he could move, the shadows themselves seemed to rearrange. Two other men appeared from nowhere. One moment the street held 4 people, and the next it held 6. These new arrivals moved with a quiet, terrifying efficiency that turned the situation inside out in under 30 seconds. There was no shouting and no weapons were drawn, just precise, absolute movements that redirected and removed the threat like variables in a solved equation. Imani stood alone on the sidewalk, her breath hitching in her chest as the adrenaline finally spiked. On the ground where the first man had been standing lay a single white business card, face down. She picked it up slowly. It had no name, just a number embossed on heavy, expensive cardstock that told her exactly who it belonged to. Her phone rang before she could even pocket the card. Unknown number. She stared at the screen for 3 full seconds before answering, her voice barely a whisper. "Are you hurt?" The voice on the other end was calm, measured, and carried the unmistakable weight of Ryu Takahashi. "No," she exhaled, her knees finally beginning to shake. "Good," he said, the silence on the line heavy with things unsaid. "Those men were sent by Nathan Cole. He will not have that opportunity again." Imani looked at the card in her hand, realizing that even when she thought she was invisible, Ryu had been watching. Imani stood before the unmarked door in a quiet corner of Dorville, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The address Ryu's man had sent was a ghost on every map she'd searched, a residential-looking block where the air smelled of toasted sesame oil and sweet wood smoke instead of the cold exhaust of downtown Atlanta. She sat in her car for 4 long minutes, the rational part of her brain reminding her that she was a woman with $7 in her checking account and no business meeting a man whose name made elite restaurant managers sweat. But she also had a mountain of debt and the memory of Ryu's men appearing like shadows to save her life. The door opened before she could even raise a hand to knock. Ryu's right hand stood aside with practiced, silent economy, gesturing her inside. She followed him through a narrow corridor that smelled of barley tea and cedar wood, leading into a room that stopped the air in her lungs. It wasn't the glass-walled opulence of the Alderon. This was something deeper, more permanent. Soft light from paper lanterns glowed against dark timber walls, and traditional ink paintings hung with the quiet authority of things that take decades to master. Ryu Takahashi was already seated, but as she entered, the Mafia boss did something that shocked her more than the room itself. He stood. In the world of high-rise power she had once occupied, and the service industry she had just left, Men like Ryu didn't stand for waitresses from Southwest Atlanta. He gestured to the seat across from him and waited for her to sit before he resumed his place. In the warm lantern light, his professional armor seemed slightly less engaged, revealing the intense stillness that seemed to be his natural state of existence. He looked at her across the table, his tattoos dark against his skin in the soft glow. "You came," he said, his voice low and unhurried. "I asked," Imani replied, her voice steadier than she felt, as she wrapped her hands around a warm ceramic teacup that had been waiting for her. She met his gaze, refusing to be the ghost he had seen at the restaurant. If she was going to step back into the light, she would do it on her own terms, facing the most dangerous man in the city with the one thing she had left, the truth.
Ryu set down his tea with the deliberateness of a man who did nothing carelessly. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. Instead, he recited the fragments of a life she thought she had buried. He spoke of Imani Brooks, the former senior auditor whose license was suspended 3 years ago following an investigation into a partner's embezzlement, a partner who had since been linked to similar schemes elsewhere. He spoke of her father's mounting debts and the room at the hospital she visited every night. "You've been surviving," he said, his voice not unkind but heavy with the weight of her reality, "when you should have been working." Imani kept her face still, though the mention of her past cost her a piece of her composure. She asked him if there was a point to this list of her tragedies, and Ryu met her gaze directly. He wanted her to work for him as his personal strategist and translator for every negotiation and every contract where language was the difference between trust and betrayal. He wasn't looking for a waitress, he was looking for the woman who knew how to spot a lie before it was even fully spoken. "What I am offering you is legitimate, documented, and properly compensated," Ryu said, anticipating her hesitation. He acknowledged that while his business was complicated, she would be tasked with the legal side, nothing more. Imani looked down at the ceramic cup, the warmth of the tea seeping into her palms as she weighed the decision. She thought of the hospital bills and the years she had spent making herself small in rooms where she understood every word. She looked up, setting her terms with the same precision she used to audit a ledger. "The work must be separate," she said slowly. "Whatever else your organization does, I don't see it, I don't know it, and I don't translate it." She told him she would set her own rate, and most importantly, if she ever heard something at his table that she believed was wrong, she would say so directly to him, just as she had at the restaurant. Something changed in Ryu's face then, a subtle, deep shift, as if he were hearing something he had stopped expecting to hear from anyone in his world. "Agreed," he said, his voice quieter than before, as if the word carried a new weight. The room settled into a silence that wasn't uncomfortable, but thick with the gravity of a real agreement. From the wall, Ryu's right hand spoke for the first time all evening, dryly noting that the tea was getting cold. Imani found herself laughing, a genuine, unguarded sound that seemed to rearrange the very air in the room. Ryu watched her, and for a fleeting moment, his own expression was the most honest thing she had seen all night. 3 weeks later, Imani Brooks sat in a glass-walled boardroom on the 32nd floor of a midtown Atlanta high-rise, translating a $40 million commercial real estate negotiation with the same quiet precision she had once used to pour wine. It was a different room and a different table, but she was a completely different woman. She had spent 21 days navigating the legitimate side of Ryu Takahashi's empire, ensuring every clause was examined and every party understood. The lead developer, a man named Calhoun, who was used to dominating every room he entered, leaned back in his chair with genuine respect, admitting he had never felt so clearly understood by the other side of a table. Imani gathered her notes, feeling Ryu's attention the way one feels a sudden change in weather, present against her skin without needing to look. She had anticipated the danger of working in close proximity to a man like him, but no one had warned her about the complexity of the small things. It was the way he stood every time she entered a room, without exception, as if it were simply what one did. It was the way he had learned exactly how she took her coffee and ensured it was always there, correct and waiting, without ever mentioning it. When she spoke, Ryu didn't listen with the distracted half-attention of a man merely receiving data. He listened with his full self, his complete focus suggesting that her words were the only things in the room that mattered. She had even learned from Ryu's right hand that the entire negotiation schedule had been restructured around her availability. She had filed that information away in a quiet place, but it hummed beneath the surface of every professional interaction. As the boardroom emptied and the assistants filtered out, the energetic exhale of a completed deal left the room feeling vast and silent. Ryu stood at the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the glittering midtown trees and the distant green sprawl of the suburbs. He didn't turn immediately, acknowledging that she had done her job well. Imani held her portfolio to her chest, keeping her expression managed and professional, even as she felt the 3 weeks of building tension finally reach a breaking point. She asked if he needed anything else, her voice steady, though her heart was already beginning to react to the silence.
Ryu reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, withdrawing a small, cream-colored envelope with her name written across the front in a precise, deliberate hand. "Something I should have said differently the first time," he said, his voice carrying an edge of vulnerability she hadn't heard before, and didn't have the words for in English. Imani took the envelope, the gap of air between their fingers as she took it feeling like a physical presence, like a sudden shift in weather. She didn't open it then, she just nodded and walked to the boardroom door, leaving the 32nd floor and the deal behind. She walked half a block from the high-rise and stopped under a magnolia tree whose roots had cracked the sidewalk clean open and kept growing anyway, a sight that felt very Atlanta. She opened the envelope to find a single, thick card with 4 words written in his native tongue. The translation assembled itself in her mind with the automatic ease of breathing, her 7 languages living inside her like a second skeleton, always there to hold her up. Her phone rang before she could even fully process the weight of the words. She knew who it was before she looked. Some things had stopped being surprises and started being inevitable. She answered, and for a moment there was only his silent, ambient presence on the other end, a texture of silence she had learned to recognize over the last 3 weeks. "You read it," he said, not as a question, but because he always knew. "You can't write things like this," she whispered softly into the phone, looking up at the enormous, layered Atlanta skyline. "I know," Ryu sighed, his voice lower and more exposed than she had ever heard it, the professional armor entirely gone. "I have been in every kind of dangerous room there is. Rooms with weapons, rooms with lawyers, rooms where the wrong word ends everything." There was a pause so long she could count her own heartbeats in the silence. "And I have never once been as afraid as I am right now." Imani pressed her lips together, looking at the 4 words in her hand and feeling the exact shape of the decision in front of her. It was real. Whatever this was, it was real. She folded the card slowly and put it in her pocket, right against her heartbeat. "I'm going to see my mother," she said finally, her step lighter than it had been in 3 years. Atlanta was full of stories, and this one was just beginning.